Hi, I'm Bob German. Welcome to Microsoft Teams App Camp, an on-demand workshop where you'll learn how to port a simple web application to be a full-featured Microsoft Teams application and how to sell it in the Microsoft Teams App Store. This lab builds on the core Teams application, so we'll assume that you've completed Lab A-03 and possibly some of the other extended labs before beginning this lab. First, a little bit of background. Monetized Teams apps can actually be purchased in the Teams App Store, via the Teams Admin Center, or in Microsoft AppSource. So there's multiple opportunities to sell your application. A monetized application is actually a combination of a Teams application with a manifest and everything you've learned so far in these labs, and something called a transactable SaaS offer. So a SaaS offer, software as a service offer, is one of the ways that our partners can sell software via Microsoft's commercial marketplace. And I want to recommend another video by David Starr called Anatomy of a SaaS Offer. If you watch that video, you'll see that towards the end, David brings up this diagram and explains the components of a complete solution, including a Microsoft Teams application, which is shown on the far right of the chart, and the other components needed from a commercial marketplace perspective. There's AppSource and the Teams App Store, which are hosted services by Microsoft. You don't have to write them, but you do have to configure them through the Partner Center. And in the case of the Teams App Store, some of the information comes from your Teams App Manifest. And that allows those services to run when somebody makes a purchase. They get redirected to your landing page. The labs are based on some sample code for a landing page, webhook, and licensing service. So we'll point you to the code, but we've already hosted it for you. So the lab instructions involve you connecting the Northwind Orders application to the licensing service and going through an AppSource simulator to make a purchase and see the application enforce licensing. So let me demonstrate that for you now. So after making some coding changes and an Azure AD change, you'll actually have this result, which is if you try to run the application and you haven't purchased it, you're going to get this error message. And then you can go in, and the lab instructions will walk you into this. You'll go to the AppSource simulator, which is hosted for you in this case, or there's instructions if you want to host it yourself. And I'm going to purchase the app. And in this case, we've made the AppSource simulator green in the background because we just want it to be clear what you're seeing. So this is the AppSource simulator. I'm going to purchase this application. I'll purchase 5 seats, and we'll choose the seat-based plan for that and make the purchase. And that will send us to the application's landing page. And to make that visible, the background has been changed to blue for the landing page. This is your chance to configure the app, whatever that means. And in this case, it's super simple. We're just going to ask what country, and we just have a few country choices here. And provision, is where you would actually provision some kind of service. And then there's some license management in here. And so I'm going to go into license settings, and I could either add a user license here, and this uses the Graph API to do it, or easier, I could just turn on this first come, first served. And what that means is the first 5 users in this case who come and use the app are automatically going to be assigned a license. And then allow over assignment would basically say, look, I'll true it up later. I'll follow up with the customer, but I'm going to let them use more licenses that they've purchased. This is all up to you. You can decide how this works. So now that I've done that, I can go back to the application and refresh it, and it will come up and work. And if I go back to that license management screen, there we go. I'm going to see that I have actually been assigned that license. So the sample application itself is here in this repository. And actually there's a bunch of different samples for all different kinds of Microsoft 365 applications. And there's a couple of Teams ones in here, but in the lab, you'll be using the Northwind Orders application just to kind of build on the labs that are already there. And then you'll be using the AppSource mockup, which is here, and then also SaaS sample web API and SaaS sample web app. This is what you would write as an ISV to handle the landing page, the webhooks, and also handle the actual license management. And we started off an earlier version of this lab. We actually had people deploy these services, but we decided that it would just be a lot easier, especially if people don't necessarily have an Azure subscription, if we just hosted a copy of these 3 projects for you. And so we did that. So if you go into the actual instructions in the lab, you'll see that the first thing that you're going to do is update the environment file to point at this hosted version of the app. And this may change. We're actually looking for a more permanent home for it. So we might actually change these details. So you might look a little different when you get to it. And then there's some code that actually calls the licensing service. And really, this isn't that instructive in terms of monetization. It's really more about how to call an API from another app, because all we're really doing here is calling this licensing endpoint to see if we have a license. And we're calling on behalf of the current user so that the licensing service can actually figure out who the user is and whether or not they already have a license, in which case it will return, okay. Or if they can be assigned a license dynamically, also returns okay, or if there's no licenses for them. So that's basically what the coding changes are all about, is just kind of connecting those things up. And then the other thing we need to do is to allow your app to call this hosted sample app. And that's what this grant consent is. What this is going to do is show you how you can call a service that's in a different tenant, that's registered and hosted centrally from your tenant. So let me just walk you through this process, because it is a little tricky. And normally something like the landing page would handle this by generating this URL in code and directing the user to it. But here we're going to kind of do it manually, because we're sort of working under the covers here, where your lab project is going to call my service, right? So I put this on the clipboard, and now I'm just going to go into a different tenant. And let me go into Azure AD as well. And what I'm going to do is sort of build up this URL. So let me paste in the URL, and there's a spot here for tenant ID, and it wants the tenant ID where I'm going to be using this service from. So let me just pop into there. So here's my tenant ID that I'm now gonna put this into, and I'll just put in where it says tenant ID, and then the client ID is the client ID of my app that I have hosted for you. And so you have that in the instructions. It's in your environment file by now. Actually, both of these values are in your environment file if you're following the lab instructions. And now I'll put that in. And now I'm going to hit enter. And I'm going to get asked to log in, and I'm going to get a consent dialog. So this is now inviting me to consent to allowing the licensing app, the sample licensing app, to act on behalf of users from my application. So let me go ahead and accept that. And at the end, I get this error, which says the site can't be reached in its local host. And that's actually expected, because if I was fully building out this solution, I would redirect the user to this page, get the consent, and then I would set the redirect URL to go back to my page. But in this case, I didn't do that, so I'm just getting sent to localhost, and it just doesn't really look like it worked, but it did. Because now I can actually go into my enterprise apps, and I'm going to see that this Contoso monetization has been created, because this is really where that license resides. So then after that, I'm going to go into my app registration, and I can do that here as well. And I can add permission to call the sample licensing application. And I can go into my app permissions. Add a permission. And instead of picking Microsoft Graph, I'm going to pick an app that my organization uses. And then let me just put that same client ID in there. There it is. And now I can add it to the permission scope available to my application. So if you go down the other path and you host the Northwind Orders service in your same tenant, then you don't need to do that first part, but you'll still need to give yourself permission to call that API. Now, in the last part of the lab, we'll walk you through some of the code that would be code that you would have to write. So I want you to understand it. First, here's some code from the landing page. When that landing page gets called, it's going to be passed a token right on the URL. I can show you actually. If I go back to the AppSource simulator and I cancel my subscription, and I'll purchase it again, and you'll see that I'm going to get sent to the landing page. And there's this big long token here on the end of the URL. It's going to pass that token to the AppSource simulator, which is sort of playing the part of the marketplace API. And it's going to get back information about the subscription that had been encoded into that token. The subscription ID, the offer ID, the plan ID, these are all things that you would have set up in Partner Center. The subscription name, who purchased it, the ID, the tenant ID of the purchaser, right? The purchaser ID is the user ID of the user, right? And all this information is kind of right here. So that's just maybe to get you started with how you would build such a service. And then the second thing we'll take a look at is the webhooks. So these are hooks that are called if somebody goes back into AppSource and maybe they change the plan, or they decide to buy some more seats, or they cancel like I just showed, then these webhooks are going to get called. And the reason that that all works in our sample is because they've provided these webhooks, and you can see how they work. And then finally, there's the license check itself, which is the server side. When we check the license in the Northwind Orders app, this is what it calls to actually come in and check the license. Now, again, they're storing it in a SQL Azure database. You might do something completely different. Totally okay. The point is that you're somehow wiring your Teams app to a service that will check the license. So just to review, what you saw was the AppSource mock run. I purchased some licenses. It sent me to the landing page in your SaaS web app, which was a sample that was hosted for you. That implemented a simple license management scheme. And then the Northwind Orders app called that same underlying service that would be the licensing part of your app in order to check the license. Thanks for watching this Microsoft Teams App Camp briefing. I hope it's helpful to you and that you have fun and smooth sailing as you complete the lab. And I also hope to see your app in the Microsoft Teams App Store soon. Thanks for watching.